Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Today, we're going to be talking about a really fascinating book. It's called Learning to See Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. To do so, I'm joined today by the author, Dr. Keith Sawyer, who is a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. The book is beautiful. I highly recommend it. My wife and we literally had it out on our coffee table, even though I know it's not technically a coffee table book, but just the layouts and the way in which you kind of externalize the conversations that you had so that you really feel like you're getting to know a lot of really deeply trained and expert design professionals through these conversations. It's very much reflected in the book. We'll get into the book in a bit, but before we do that, we always like to kick things off by hearing a little bit more from you about your career journey. How did you get to this point in your professional life?
I spent my career as a creativity researcher, it's just the most wonderful researcher to be, I think, starting all the way back in graduate school when I discovered there was such a thing. I was in a PhD program in psychology at the University of Chicago, and a professor named Mike Csikszentmihalyi
Sure.
there, and he has now made such an impact for his research on flow and positive psychology. A lot of people don't know that he was first a creativity researcher. In my first year of graduate school, I took a class from him called The Psychology of Creativity, and I was hooked. I didn't realize you could actually do research in how people be creative. So it's, for me, it goes all the way back to my PhD program.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the flow state that you're talking about, it does make sense when you think about it, where like for folks to be creative in a lot of ways, there's almost like a neurochemistry to it. They're mental states that kind of allow you to kind of unlock things. And that's something that was very much, I think, reflected in the book. Maybe we could go there next. What drove you to write the book? Because I know you've been in this space for a little while. What led to learning to see?
I'm not an artist and I'm not a designer, and I haven't been to art and design school. So I approached this research almost like an anthropologist, trying to figure out what was going on. My own research has been with improvisational groups because I'm a jazz pianist, and that's been my creative outlet all the way back to, high school and college. And my first academic journal article was a study of jazz creativity. In fact, it was called Improvisational Creativity. So that was back in 1992 when my article was the first article by a creativity researcher about jazz improvisation. And then I went on and studied Chicago improvisational theater. I was at the University of Chicago. So that's what I became known for, is my studies of group creativity and ensemble improvisation.
So that's like Second City and like that kind of space in Chicago?
Yeah, exactly. Chicago, when I was there in the 1990s, it was already known worldwide as a center for improvisational theater. So I played piano in a couple of different improvisational theater groups. Because I was a jazz pianist, it actually was a really good fit because you have to be able to improvise with the action that's going on stage.
Wow. I may need to have you back on because one of my pipe dreams for the podcast is to get some live accompaniment. And generally, when I ask people to do it, they freak out because it's not an easy thing to do. A lot of people are more comfortable, I think, when there's structure there. But I guess that's part of what comes through in the book. And I imagine in your research around improvisation, one of the chapters in the book is on the importance of constraints. And, there still is a lot of structure that's involved in creativity. What did you uncover, taking a step back? Can you talk a little bit about your methodology? Because like I said, it does really feel like we're right there with you when you're having these conversations. But can you outline for us like what really went into the research that drove the book?
Oh, absolutely. And I will say that this tension between structure and improvisation, or constraints and freedom, that's one of the core messages of all of my research, whether it's jazz ensembles or improvisational theater, is that there really is no such thing as completely open and free improvisation. I use this term guided improvisation in a lot of my writings. You might say structured improvisation, but I like guided a little bit better.
Yeah.
So what I found when I went into art and design schools, and these are professional degree programs. The students are getting Bachelor of Fine Arts degrees or Master of Fine Arts degrees. So they're already very talented. You have to submit a portfolio of work to simply get into one of these programs. So you might think, well, what is it that they have to learn? They already know how to mix paints. They already know how to use Adobe Creative Suite.
Yeah.
But these professors, so my book is based on over 100 interviews with professors, and I got really experienced professors. These are professional working artists. And
Right. I think if I read it right, you were saying the average tenure is like 20 years on average. Like these are folks who really had a career teaching people creative practices.
yeah, and it's just so compelling. Really, my book is the stories that are told by these experienced educators.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, they are professional creatives. They have their paintings are in nationally known museums like the Museum of Modern Art.
Hmm.
If they're designers, they have design consultancies. You've probably seen their illustrations in the New York Times or the New
Hmm.
Yorker magazine. But they also have, like you say, almost 20 years of experience in the classroom.
Right.
And these are top art and design schools. The School of Visual Arts in Manhattan,
Right.
for example, is one of the universities I went to.
Yeah.
And when I talked to and interview these over 100 people in every discipline, so I wanted to do art and design, and
Hmm.
I didn't want it to be just a book about painting or just a book about architecture,
Yeah.
about the shared underlying essence of all of these visual creative disciplines. As you say, one of the main themes of what they do in their classrooms is constraints.
Hmm.
They give the students highly constrained project assignments. Sometimes they'll call them parameters because the word constraint might be,
Yeah.
I don't know, a little bit harsh in some people's minds, but most of them really do just say constraints. And I've got quotations in the book. And by the way, the book really is almost purely, it's a collection of quotations from these compelling creators and educators. A lot of them will say things like, creativity is enhanced by constraints, or they'll say, there's no creativity without constraints, or
Right.
they'll say, without constraints, the students just don't know what to do and they can't be creative.
Hmm.
Over and over again. And again, this is art and design disciplines. You might think this would be the case. I talked to a couple of different advertising professors. So that makes sense for constraints. You're going to have a client. They're going to
Sure.
tell you, we need the campaign to work for this audience and we want to get 10 million eyeballs. So there are going to be constraints in a field like advertising, but it might be a little more surprising that painting professors say the same things. They talk in exactly the same way. And I mean, exactly the same way as an advertising professor. So that blew my mind. I
Mm.
really, like a lot of people, I would think that painting would be very different from something like advertising. But
Hmm.
that's one of the powerful messages of my book is that this really is an underlying core that's shared by art and design.
Yeah, it was striking. It makes me think of two things. One is I think there's a quote in there that like constraints are like the channel through which the river flows, like there's a lot of really deep insights and it's pretty steady throughout the book, like where frequently books, chapters will open with a thoughtful quote from Confucius and then get into the rest of the stuff that they're writing about, but pretty much the entirety of the book is lifting from those conversations. And the second thing that struck me when you were talking there is this idea of, durable skills, and creativity is frequently talked about as a durable skill, but I haven't really seen it manifested as clearly as it is in your research, where, to your point, the same underlying structures are applicable across the wide variation of disciplines that kind of sit under the umbrella of art and design. It's interesting that you called it learning to see as well, where it sounds like, again, from getting into the book, that's a pretty consistent message as well, that there is this idea, and it's almost an abstraction of literally seeing. But can you talk a little more about how you landed on that title and how that kind of emerged through your research?
When I started out the project, I was calling it Learning How to Create
Mm.
because I'm a creativity researcher and I've also done some research in the science of how people learn.
Hmm.
So I've done a lot of research and scientific publications on how people learn to be creative. When
Yeah.
I first went into an art school, it was Savannah College of Art and Design,
Hmm.
SCAD, in
Hmm.
Savannah, Georgia. And I didn't know anything about art or design. In my first interview, I said, "Hey, I'm doing this project on learning how to create." And I had a semi-structured interview because I like to be as rigorous as possible. The
Yeah.
first question on my page was, how do you teach people how to be creative? And this was a painter I was interviewing, and she said she was very uncomfortable with the question. And her answer was something like, "Well, I don't really think I'm doing that."
Hmm.
And so what do you mean you're not teaching people how to create? You're a painting professor, but I'm, good interviewer, good anthropologist. So the response isn't to impose what you think onto the person
Yeah.
you're interviewing. The response is to say, like I did, "Oh, well, what are you teaching students then?" And this happened over and over again, that when I mentioned creativity or when I asked people how they teach students to be creative, they, across the board, artists and designers, they rejected the term. They
Hmm.
would say, "I'm not teaching people how to be creative," or they would say, "It's not possible to teach people how to be creative."
Yeah.
So at the end of my interview, I didn't know what to call the project or to call the book. I can't call it learning how to create because, all the artists and designers are going to reject the book and it really
Right.
isn't accurate to what they're doing. So I would ask them, what should I call the book? I'm going to write a book about this. What should I call it? And this came up over and over again in my interviews, that what they are teaching is they're teaching students how to see.
Hmm.
They explicitly said that. This is the language they used. "I'm
Yeah.
teaching students how to see." Students don't know how to see. And that's puzzling, right? How do you get your mind around that? Students have been looking at art their entire lives. These are 19, 20-year-olds, more so than the graduate students in Master of Fine Arts programs. So, yes, they know how to see already, but the undergraduates, they don't. And professors tell me, I said, "Well, don't they learn that in the first semester, in the fall of their first year? Then they could go off and do everything else. So, what are you teaching them after that?" But no, they all said it takes at least 2 years
Hmm.
before the students learn how to see.
Yeah.
Now, that's intriguing to me because I don't know how to see. I'm not a
Right.
painter. I haven't been to art school.
Hmm.
So that just drew me in. It was such a compelling concept.
Hmm. Your methodology kind of reminds me a little bit of cognitive task analysis, which is much more on the cognitive side. This is almost like creative task analysis or creative practice analysis, but like there is an element of expertise. Experts frequently don't know how to talk about their expertise. And that's where having someone like yourself to provide them with a semi-structured conversation that sort of leads to discovery. It's interesting hearing about your background in improvisation, where, in some ways, the conversation is best when it's opening up discovery for both the interviewer and the people interviewed. What kind of surprising moves happen? That's the other thing I think about in this case. We'll probably get into talking about artificial intelligence in a bit. But to me, when I think about creativity and seeing things differently, there is that element of, almost understanding the obvious thing and then breaking through and seeing things through a new light. What did you discover on that front?
You're right that professionals often don't know what they're doing. It can be a kind of tacit understanding or practice based knowledge. And I think
Yeah.
that's true of artists and designers, just like everyone else. But what makes my book so compelling is that these are artists and designers who've been teaching students for almost 20 years. So to teach students how to be like them, to teach
Mm.
students how to engage in the same kind of creative practice. So to teach someone to do what you're doing, you have to reflect on what you're doing in a deeper kind of way. And you have to become articulate about it
Mm.
in a way that other practitioners might not have to. So the book ends up being about creativity at a professional level.
Hmm.
So I started out interviewing professors about how they teach in studio classes. Then I learned that they actually are professional artists and designers. then I learned this is what they're teaching. They're teaching students how to engage in practice like them. So the book really is, and you said this a couple of minutes ago, it's a very deep and compelling view of what creativity is.
Hmm.
And, I'm a creativity researcher, so I've been reading definitions of creativity for a long time. But what I found these professional creatives saying was just a very developed and highly articulated version of what creativity is.
Yeah. And it does seem like there's a level of abstraction because you are cutting across a wide variety of expertise in creative fields, whether it's, painters, mostly visual designers, is that right? Or was there a focus on visual design?
Yes, absolutely. It's visual creativity, whether it is art or design. I mean, there are
Hmm.
design disciplines that focus more on service design or experience design, but my focus was on the visual arts.
Good, good. So your next book can be on creative practice of podcasting, in which case there's an entire,
That's right.
especially audio podcasting, the field's wide open in that respect. But I was struck by also the depth into which you go to describe some of the assignments and kind of the nature of art and design education. Also, as someone who hasn't really studied that, I haven't really been in those types of classes, I was struck by the level of thought that goes into designing those types of assignments. And perhaps, this starts to get into the future of work and the future of education, where I felt like there were a lot of insights into how creative instruction thinks about assignments that perhaps is ahead of the game, when we think about some of the reaction around generative AI and how it's undermining our ability to do assessments. In a lot of ways, I felt like the assignments that you write about in the book almost provide a different way of thinking about educating folks. Can you talk a little bit more about how the assignments part of the conversation came together?
Oh, absolutely. And I should start out for the listeners saying, if you haven't been there, what happens as a student is that you're presented with a project assignment, project brief. So this is what you're going to be doing for the next 2 weeks. And this is what's going to come out at the end. When I went there, I thought, a professor might say, in the first half of the semester, you're going to paint fire, and we're going to experiment with visual representations of fire. So go make a painting about fire, bring it back, and we'll talk about it. I thought it was going to be completely open.
Hmm.
And that couldn't be further from the truth. What I saw, for example, here at University of North Carolina, a textile artist named Beth Grabowski, printmaking, she taught a class for undergraduates, and one of her assignments was 2 weeks. Students had 2 weeks. The assignment that she handed out was 3 pages, single space. And all of that was constraints and guidelines for what the students had to do, including a lot of interim steps. And this is completely universal in these art and design classes that students don't come in all the way at the end with the final product.
Hmm.
They come in a few days in with one step towards the final product. And then a few days after that, they come in with the second step toward the final project. And this is, as I said, it's painting, it's architecture, it's sculpture, it's photography. And what's going on is that the professors engage in a kind of creative process that's iterative, wandering, and nonlinear.
Hmm.
They believe that good ideas emerge from engaging in a process. Good ideas don't come at the beginning
Yeah.
of the process. But students don't yet know how to engage in that kind of process. They're very gifted technically, but they still create in a linear fashion. They have the idea that they want to paint and then they execute it. So
Hmm.
what comes out at the end is the same thing they thought at the beginning. Professional artists and designers say that's not the best way to create work. And it's not going to be great work if you create that way. So, how would you teach someone out of creating in a linear way and teach them into creating in an iterative and wandering way? So, that's what the constraints do.
Yeah.
Constraints are actually constraining the steps in the process so that
Hmm.
they prevent students from doing what they already know how to do, which is going through a linear process where they generate what they thought they were going to do at the beginning. So that's
Hmm.
a great example of what constraints do. They
Hmm.
prevent you from doing what you already know how to do, that professors know is not going to generate the best work. and then they guide you through a process that you don't yet know how to engage in.
Yeah, and the emergence that you talk about in the creative process is something that was certainly striking to me. That and also there's a lot of talk about, engaging with the materials, which is an interesting concept. And, it's great to hear you're a creativity researcher because that kind of extends perhaps a little more to what might be interesting to my audience who isn't predominantly in art and design, is like, what can we learn from your research here that can apply to creativity more broadly? And one of the things that really did strike me was this idea of engaging with the materials. It's almost like a conversation with what you can and can't do with the stuff. And there's a Picasso quote in there, which I can't quite remember. Maybe you do, but it's like, you don't really know what the painting is until you start painting. And I think that's important just as a broader point where, like, in some ways you have to start to make things before you really know what you're going to make.
I think it's a universal message from creativity research, and this even predates my work in art or design, is this critique of what I call the linear insight model,
Yeah.
that creativity is about having a brilliant idea, and then you execute the idea by going through a fairly linear process. And then the idea that you had at the beginning is what comes out at the end.
Hmm.
That's what these students do who come in at 18 as gifted technically. But it's also a misconception that pretty much everyone has about creativity, that it really is about having the big ideas. So I've spent my whole career criticizing this. I call it a myth.
Hmm.
My 2013 book is called Zigzag
Mm.
because it's about the wandering path of creativity.
Yeah.
And this is not just art and design. So one of the things I do when I give workshops is I try to disabuse people of this myth that it's not about having a big idea at the beginning. It's about engaging in a particular kind of process with a certain set of mindsets that are learnable. And
Hmm.
then when you engage in that kind of process, good ideas emerge that you couldn't have thought of at the beginning.
Hmm.
It's engaging in the process that results in good ideas. I mean, in business for a long time now, people have been talking about the pivot, that a startup company will develop a smartphone app for, let's say, photo sharing or whatever. And then
Hmm.
that turns out not to work out. But in the process of doing the photo sharing app, they end up making a collaborative learning app. So then they pivot and they go in a different direction, but they couldn't have known about the potential for the collaborative learning app unless they had first developed the photo sharing app. So this happens over and over again, stories of invention and entrepreneurship.
Hmm. It's interesting. You were saying a word there that was a direction that I wanted to go next, which is around collaboration. You've studied improvisation, and that's a collaborative effort. And then the teaching practice within arts and design is a social, somewhat collaborative engagement, but it is still at the end of the day, folks are assessed on their individual bodies of work. How do you think about that tension between the need for the artist to express their individuality through their work, while at the same time we're becoming increasingly aware, I'm sure a lot of your creativity research has looked at this as well, how collaborative human experiences are in many ways the thing that we want to cultivate? How do you think about collaboration relative to sort of individual artistry?
I'm primarily known for my research on group creativity, and the reason for that is because of my studies of jazz ensembles.
Mm.
I was never that interested in a solo saxophone player doing what goes on in the mind when this person is soloing at home in their garage or woodshed or whatever. I've
Yeah.
always been interested in the ensemble dynamics, what goes on
Hmm.
between people. And that's even more obvious when you look at improvisational theater on stage,
Hmm.
because it's an ensemble art form. You've got two people or three people. And what happens when you have this kind of ensemble improvisation is that you can't plan ahead. You can't have the idea at the beginning because you don't know what your partner is going to do next.
Yeah.
Partner does something and you have to be willing to go with that, or else it's just going to be a horrible performance. It doesn't work unless everyone builds on everyone else. So that's
Right.
the power of collaboration, is for new ideas to emerge from the interaction, from the dialogue. So
Hmm.
absolutely. And my first business book was called Group Genius.
Hmm.
for exactly that reason, because of
Mm-hmm.
the implications of ensemble improvisation. So, yes, you're singing my song when we talk about the importance of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. But then when it comes to like learning to see, that is ultimately something that's assessed at the individual level. How is that different, or how do you perhaps get there? Like what kind of practices did you uncover when you started talking to these art and design instructors?
That's a really good point because I did not see students working together in teams
Hmm.
to generate their work.
Yeah.
So you don't have a group of painting students painting something together.
Yeah.
You don't have a group of graphic design students developing posters together. So that was interesting. Maybe not the most natural next step in my career. I probably should have studied another group phenomenon, but I wanted to see whether or not these basic principles of creativity would extend
Yeah.
to these other types of creative disciplines. So people
Hmm.
don't paint together.
Hmm.
But what happens in these studio classes is very much collaborative, that students bring in their work and not their final work, but I already mentioned they have constrained projects where they have to bring in interim steps along the
Yeah.
way. The reason why they bring them into class is so that all the other students and the professor can look at that and talk about it. So students always have other people looking at what they do and talking about it. And then those conversations influence what they do next.
Hmm.
So let's say the 2 week assignment I told you about has 4 steps, let's say. So students bring in the first, and then everyone talks about it. Then they get this feedback and they go back to their own studio or wherever they're doing their work in their dorm room, and they generate the next step. So that's very much a dialogue. It's very much collaborative, even though they're
Hmm.
not collaboratively generating the same thing together. They
Hmm.
are collaboratively benefiting from the community in the classroom.
Yeah. Maybe extrapolating a little bit out, and I will bring up artificial intelligence because it's 2025 and it comes up all the time. But there's a lot of interesting insights I think that can be drawn around the future of work, the future of creativity, and how humans can be trained to be creative. How, there's some innate technical capabilities, absolutely, but there is that way of seeing, that way of kind of operating, working with others, taking feedback, I guess, is a big takeaway from a lot of this practice where like if you're hiding your stuff and afraid to be evaluated, you're only going to get so far. There's a lot of thinking now that the way in which we work will be transformed by generative AI and some of the emerging technical capabilities that are out there. As someone who studied creativity in real depth, I'd love to hear a little bit of your thinking on that.
I think it comes back to the creative process. So I mentioned my original work on jazz improvisation and theater improvisation. Then what I find in art and design is also improvisation. It's an improvisational process. It's wandering, it's iterative, it's nonlinear. A couple of months ago, I wrote a Substack post. The title was I'm a creativity researcher and I'm not impressed with Gen AI. And the reason is I'm interested in how people work. I'm a psychologist. I want to understand people better and how people create.
Hmm.
The way Gen AI creates is totally different from the way people create. Gen AI does not engage in a wandering iterative process. It does not engage in improvisation. It doesn't engage in a dialogue with materials,
Hmm.
which, as you said a few minutes ago, is absolutely critical to all art and design. They will talk about the importance of getting something down on paper before they know what they're doing. And then the dialogue between their own mind and what it is they put on paper, they really do talk about the work they've generated as if it has a mind of its own, as if
Hmm.
it has its own identity. So we really are engaging in a conversation, even though it's a conversation between me and an inanimate object that I've generated, but they don't see
Yeah.
it that way. They see dynamics and flux in the works that they've generated.
Hmm.
That's improvisational, and it is something I call a dialogue of creativity. So, having said all that, I use Gen AI all the time, and we can talk about how I use that in my own iterative and wandering process. But when a Gen AI generates something, it does not do it the way a person does it. So if you're an advocate of Gen AI, you might say, so what? All I care about is whether there's something interesting at the end. And that's fine if that's what you care about. But I care about the process and I care about understanding people better. Gen AI does not work that way. No one's trying to make a Gen AI that does work that way. I
Mm,
don't think Gen AI will ever work that way.
yeah. It's interesting. It reminds me, one of my favorite quotes lately is from Charles and Ray Eames, which is never delegate understanding. And related to that, someone was talking about how understanding is a labor. Like it actually takes work. And a lot of the creative practices that you're describing in the book, they require struggle. They're not easy. And doing hard things is something that I'm concerned about in terms of our educational process. And then, especially in light of some of these tools that are out there, I've talked about it before on the show. I'm the parent of a 6-year-old, and I like to talk about the training wheels problem where you get your kid up on training wheels, they're tooling around as a 4-year-old loving life. You get excited about it, you take the training wheels off, and they get frustrated because it's hard and they just want to kind of give up on the practice. It does seem like there's some meaningful perspective in the book, and I imagine based on your research on why we want to almost train ourselves and reward and encourage folks struggling. You talk about ambiguity as well in the book, like the idea that there are things that are not going to be complete that we have to kind of sweat over. And that sweating, that struggle is in some ways the essence of creativity.
It is. And one of the core findings of learning sciences research is that learning is effortful.
Hmm.
So if it's easy, you're probably not learning.
Hmm.
And I would say it's the same way with creativity. If it's easy, you're probably not engaging in a substantive and meaningful process of creativity.
Hmm.
It's one reason why the linear model of creativity is not effective because linearity is easy. I know
Yeah.
what I'm going to do and I'm doing it. But
Hmm.
not knowing what you're doing while you're doing it, that's a psychologically and personally very challenging. And it's uncertain. People don't like uncertainty, people don't like ambiguity. But effective creators have learned not only how to tolerate ambiguity, but they've learned how to welcome ambiguity and to use that productively. Well, people talk a lot about failure in creativity. It's almost a truism. And that's one of the chapters in my book. It's absolutely the case that
Hmm.
these professors need to teach their students not only how to tolerate failure, but how to recognize failure as an opportunity to go in a different direction that you hadn't thought of yet. So it's another way that the way people create is completely different from the way a Gen AI might create. Gen AI
Hmm.
doesn't engage in this type of nonlinear wandering process. And again, people can say, I don't care. What it generates is useful for me, and it
Right.
saved me 5 days of work and it did it in 5 minutes. And yeah, do it. I'll do it myself if I can save 5 days of work. But
Right.
as a creativity researcher, I want to understand more about how people work. And what I see, and really in this book, Learning to See, it's really a book about human action and it's a book
Mm.
about personal transformation. It's a book about cognitive science. How do people work? How do people get through life? How do people learn how to do anything that's different from what they already know how to do? How
Yeah.
do you go through a fundamental transformation from a dysfunctional person to a functional person? That's what parents teach, and that's what psychotherapists have to do. That's what these professors are doing. So I think there are lessons in learning to see. I mean, think about it. Becoming an actualized individual requires you to be able to see yourself clearly. And in many cases, you're not fully actualized because you're not able to see clearly. So,
Mm.
learning to see is a powerful concept. I think it goes way beyond art and design.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of productive struggle and desirable difficulty, which are some of my favorite, turns of phrase coming out of learning science. So I imagined, like we're talking about the creative process, but you're also very much about teaching. This book, Learning to See, is very much about what do great educators do in this space. And I'd say it's surprising in that way. And perhaps there's some insight or perspective you can share about what this might mean for the future of education. It does seem like we could learn a lot from this model, this instructional model, as opposed to perhaps a traditional model, which is, I've heard it described as cells and bells. You go from classroom to classroom, the bell rings and you're sitting in your chair and it's very like structured. It's not ambiguous. It's not nonlinear in the way that you're describing. Perhaps it's actually not cultivating creativity, but perspectives there. Any thoughts you might want to share to folks who are thinking about the future of instruction?
Absolutely. And you know that in addition to being a creativity researcher, I'm a learning scientist. I'm active in that field, and I'm the editor of the Handbook of Learning Sciences.
Mm,
Most of that research focuses on STEM disciplines, engineering and science. There's quite a bit of research by my learning sciences colleagues that's funded by the National Science Foundation.
mm,
And things like desirable difficulties or productive failure, those
mm,
findings have come from science education. And one of the most solid findings of learning sciences research, some people associate it with constructivism, this idea that you have to be an active participant in your learning. You can't be
mm,
passive. You can't sit and listen to a lecture. You have to be actively engaged in some sort of activity or some sort of practice. Well, that's exactly what I see in art and design classes. It's very much a project-based learning model.
mm,
And project-based learning is, I would say, the consensus cutting edge of what we should be doing in science classes.
mm,
In engineering schools, many engineering schools now are completely project-based, where they really don't lecture anymore. You get 4 years of engaging in projects. And if you want to be a successful engineer, it kind of is common sense, right? Engineers create stuff. Engineering is a creative field. You're not going to learn how to create as an engineer by sitting in a lecture and learning about forces and fluid
yeah.
dynamics. Or you might need to know those things, but what you really need to know is how to engage in the practice of engineering something new. So
Mm,
yeah, project-based learning, absolutely. STEM disciplines in colleges and universities, I see it being adopted. What I see in my book, Learning to See, I think there are messages there for anyone who's engaged in teaching in a project-based learning model. So you mentioned already, I've got a chapter about constraints and another chapter about ambiguity. That's exactly what you have to do if you're doing PBL in a science classroom. You have to have those assignments are highly constrained. You can't have students go off the rails and go down a complete dead end and be scientifically incorrect. But you also have to give them the opportunity, some freedom to explore on their own in such a way that the exploratory process leads them to the correct understanding of whether it's physics or biology. So, how do you do that? Well, those are constraints. You are constraining the process to guide them in learning how to understand, not just memorizing a bunch of facts about physics, but learning how to understand at a deep level. And I also hear professors, and this is at the graduate level in science disciplines, they will tell me that their students who come in, and these are 22-year-olds going to graduate school with undergraduate degrees in chemistry. I talked to a chemistry professor in Scotland, and he said, my students come here and they don't know how to think.
mm,
They know a lot of chemistry, but they don't know how to think in chemistry. How is it that they could get through a 4 year program and get into one of the top graduate programs in chemistry and they have to pass an exam? You get a very high score on the exam and they don't know how to think. That's exactly what my art and design professors are saying. Not only I'm teaching them how to see, but I'm also teaching them how to think. So I think that very much extends to any form of advanced expertise.
First off, I'm happy you're representing for the A in STEAM. So thank you for your service, Keith. It's not just STEM. I want to add some arts there. It did make me think also about, as opposed to learning sciences, like the learning arts. Like there is like artistry
Oh,
to learning practices. But the other thing it made me think about when you were talking, it almost sounds like an argument for more studios and labs as opposed to classrooms with desks where kids are kind of expected to sit and sort of consume direct instruction, repositioning learning as an active practice.
you're right. Absolutely, it is. And in 2019, I published a book called The Creative Classroom,
Mm,
which is based in learning sciences research. And it essentially uses this notion of guided improvisation as advice for teachers. So, my
mm,
book, The Creative Classroom, is a book for teachers. how to think differently about the way you approach your students. And it is a form of project-based learning, but I would call that, as I said, guided improvisation. And that's the balance of constraint and ambiguity. You need the improvisation for students to have that opportunity to explore and construct their own knowledge, but it has to be guided in some way. So I
Mhm.
see that maybe, it makes more sense perhaps in a high school science class. You see, of course, it has to be constrained because they can't get to the wrong answer.
Right.
But in a painting class, maybe that's more counterintuitive because there is no wrong answer, there is no right answer. But I find painting classes being taught very much in the same model, that there are constraints guiding the process. So, yeah,
Mm.
I would call that guided improvisation. So, when I study improvisation, I see everything through the lens of improvisation. So, we've been talking about learning the process of creating an art design. Yeah, I would say it's an improvisational process.
And, to your point, I love the title when you were talking about zigzagging in one of your books, where I've been thinking about that, where as more of these generative tools and artificial intelligence are measuring collectively what humans have done so far, that does almost challenge us in the moment to zig when we could have zagged and to be non-obvious, do something surprising, see what happens, be a little more experimental and improvisational in our lives. We're getting close to time here. It's an amazing book. Hopefully, folks are intrigued. The name of the book, Learning to See Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. You got a sense of what you're getting there from the conversation with Keith so far. It's been wonderful having you. Thoughts, takeaways for folks as we get closer to wrapping up here?
I would say to welcome uncertainty. People find it very challenging, frustrating when they don't know what's going on and when they don't know what is happening. But yeah, to the extent that you can, welcome those moments and then see what emerges that you didn't think would happen ahead of time.
Mm.
So try to welcome ambiguity, try to manage uncertainty, and use that to generate something new and surprising.
Amazing stuff here with Dr. Keith Sawyer out of UNC Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. Keith, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
And for our listeners, as many of the books as we can get into the show notes, we will. Subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.